Hi, I'm Michelle. I'm an actress. I was an actress most of my life until I got sick. I was also teaching. I was teaching meditation. I was speaking a lot. I started to lose my voice. The message that I kept getting was like, there's nothing wrong with you. I started to notice, like, I guess what I later understood was bloating, but like just discomfort in myself and in my body. And then like feelings that I didn't really understand until much later. But like I remember being 14 and just having these like crazy bouts of like sadness and like darkness and being like not being able to relate to people and my weight was like always fluctuating like all through my teens. I remember my mom taking me to Weight Watchers when I was like 16 and I gained 11 pounds on Weight Watchers. And like all my friends were like having pizza and French fries. And I was sitting there like counting my lettuce things because I had this like inexplicable, like up, down, up, down, up, down. I always had this like huge distended stomach that made me feel like I looked pregnant. I was always like, it's like baby fat. I always knew I had a hormone imbalance. That's what they would call it. But like, we couldn't figure it out. And like, they put me on the birth control pill, which made me absolutely insane because it made everything just go up. And no one knew why. And then like, I'd go away for summer and come back. This was like getting into my 20s already. And I'd already been put on antidepressants. And I already just was like obsessed with working out and how big my jeans were and how I looked because I was already acting. And you know, to come on to set or to come on to something and be like, I could see it in my face. And then I would go away and come back again and I'd be like half the size that I was because my body would just like do a thing and I would lose all this weight, but then I would gain all this weight. And it didn't really matter what I was doing. I was always like working out and I would have these like insane periods where I would just bleed and be in agony and then I would be like, boyfriends thought I was crazy and then I would be normal. And then like, it was like I was five different people my whole life and constantly going to doctors because I had crazy digestive problems. I had chronic constipation, sorry, but from the time I was very little, um, mood swings, insomnia, like the anxiety, the fear that something was this like constant fear of like something going horribly wrong or that there was something wrong with me. And I kept going to doctors and I kept going to psychiatrists and they just kept saying like you need to work out more, you need to be in nutrition, you need to take these pills. And I did that for years and I was never taught to advocate for myself either. So I allowed a lot of mistreatment. Um, and that sort of like compounded with the messages that I was getting in my head, what my body was doing. And it was just like a lot of trauma on top of whatever was happening to me. And the message that I kept getting was like, there's nothing wrong with you. It's all in your head. By the time I was like in my late 20s, I knew something was like very, very not okay. Um, and around 30, like I'd sort of lost. I was so consumed with how bad I felt all the time that I just sort of like stopped doing everything. My hormones were completely out of control. And then I just like one day stopped getting my period. And that was the moment. It was around my 31st birthday and or 32nd. I just stopped getting my period. And then I started gaining weight really quickly. I'm talking 60 pounds in 2 months. And while that was happening, I was still being told that it was all in my head and that there was nothing wrong. And I was exhausted. Like, couldn't get off, like, all I could do was go to yoga because I forced myself to exercise because I thought that's what being healthy was, like eat a bag of almonds and like force, like that's when I started looking into being healthier. And I was in a deep dark place, like hated my body. A friend called me and she's like, "What are you doing for Christmas? We're all going to Thailand. We've rented this house. Why don't you come to Thailand?" And I was like, "The is Thailand?" You know. Um, so I went, and then I they all left. Like, we went for Christmas and New Year's, and then they all left and went back to their lives. And I remember just standing there like, I think I'm supposed to stay here. I don't know why, but I don't want to go home. I need to figure out why, like, what's happening in a way that I'd never done before. Like, I was someone who was like, take every pill, take whatever, doctor, doctor. Now I was like, no, no, I want to understand why. No one can tell me why. No one is bothering to find out why. And I ended up, not to get into all that, but I went to, like, they have a lot of detox resorts there. And my whole thing still was like, well, at least I'll lose some weight. And when I got there, I didn't realize how fragile and unhappy I was. I started hearing other things, and I started like I was doing energy work. Like, people were doing everything that they do in Asia, they did on me, and it was like this light bulb went off. Like, a part of me that had been dormant forever came into existence, and I just devoured it. I started reading about Eastern medicine because I'd always done yoga, but like more for exercise. So I started reading about like the origins of yoga and the different kinds of yoga. I ended up going to Bali and doing like a yoga teacher training and meeting people and learning more healings and more crazies. Everything that was presented to me, I was like, maybe this will fix me. Maybe this will fix me. I would get my period once and then it would go away again for 6 months. I would lose a little bit of weight. And it was a lot of like extremes. There was a lot of self shame and guilt and punishment and like, acceptance, punishment, acceptance, guilt, still broken, still like not normal. And I came back home. I tried to like reinvent myself a bunch of times, but it just, I couldn't hold on to anything. I was so lost and ungrounded, and it just seemed like it was getting worse and the anxiety was getting worse. I've been like living with this for almost 8 years, and or well, probably closer to 28 years. Um and then it just got like weird. Like, I noticed that I had this like lump here, but it didn't feel like it was always there. It just felt like when I did physical activity or talked too much, it would, or whatever, it would like feel worse. So for a year I was showing it to people. I'm like, what do you think this is? Like, even doctors. I had a friend who was a doctor, and she was, people were like, no, no, it's just swollen gland. You're probably fighting something. And I was always sick, I should say. Also, I had the immune system of like a fruit fly my whole life. I was always sick. And because I was doing so much yoga, I started to notice like, oh, I can't do like a chaturanga anymore. I can't use this, like, this arm isn't working properly. And then in my Kundalini yoga, where I would be like singing and chanting, I was also teaching. I was teaching meditation. I was speaking a lot. I started to lose my voice. Like, literally, I'd talk for 10 minutes and then like no voice left. And that was weird because I was a trained singer all my like younger life, I could, like, no voice left. If I walked up the flight of stairs to my apartment, I'd have to lie down. I was actually going back to Montreal to speak at a cancer center about meditation and cancer, the benefits of meditating when you have cancer. And people around me had had cancer. And my mom lost two of her closest lifelong best friends to cancer. One of my best friends at the time had just lost another friend to cancer. Like, it was like around me peripherally, but nobody in my direct life in my 6 degrees had had cancer. And I remember it was like September and it was raining and we were driving there. And I said to my mom, I'm like, you know what's ironic? And she's like, what? I said, I'm going to talk about this thing. And I'm having all these problems that, like, no one can help. And it's really like come to a head. And like, and 1 in 4 people get cancer and like no one's gotten it. And what if, and she was like, don't be ridiculous and don't be da 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 da. And and I still had this thing and it really wasn't going away and it hurt. And I was having like pain shooting down my arm. And finally, I got someone to write me a requisition for an ultrasound. And I was in Montreal and I'm like, I'm just going to go in and do it. Everyone says it's nothing. Fine. I'm going to go get it checked and then it'll be nothing. And then I'll know it's nothing, move on from life. And I went in there and I was in there for like 8 hours because they kept coming in the room and then checking with the doctor. And are you sure you knew? Like, has anyone checked this? Have you had a biopsy? And then they like left and then they came back and then they were like, you need to go have a biopsy. I was like, what is happening? And he said, okay, here's the deal. You have like something the size of a fingerling potato. It's a mass, he called it, on pressing on your thyroid. It's probably benign and, nothing, but it's giving you discomfort. So you might want to consider taking it out. Anyway, I'm going to do biopsy. I'm sure it's not cancer. And this is the first time somebody said that word. And I said, cancer of what? And he said, thyroid. And I'm like, WTF is a thyroid. And a week later, I was driving in LA, and I remember it so vividly. I'd gone to Kundalini class in the morning, and I was driving home, and I saw that I missed a call, and I called back, and he said, "Okay, so it's cancer." And I'm like, "What?" I'm like, heads up, like pull over. No. And then he proceeded to tell me all kinds of things that I, for the life of me, will never remember. And thus began my adventure with thyroid cancer. I didn't know what a thyroid was. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know anything. Nobody had any answers for me. I just felt so sorry for myself. And under that was like a lot of anger about just the life I could have had, all the trials and tribulations and struggles. And like, it was, so all of a sudden, like, I looked back at my whole life and I was like, oh, so all of these years that I was traveling and healing and doing instead of having a family, the choices that I made, I could have made different like that was how I was looking at it. Also there was like this mad rush in the 3 weeks between diagnosis and surgery to like harvest and freeze some eggs because I may not be able to have children. And like, but what do they do for that? They inject you with hormones. So like it was a nightmare. And I was very angry at everybody and everything. I showed up at this doctor's office. I will never forget. I had all these questions I'd written down, papers of things I'd read, printouts of stuff. And this old guy, he looked like he was 900 years old. Like I was the last surgery of his entire surgical life. Sits down and I sit down and he looks at me and says, "Oh, good. You've been on the internet. How about I do my spiel, and then if you have any questions, we'll see if there's time for you to ask them at the end." That shut me. That I immediately shrunk to like 3 centimeters big. And there was probably a time when I would have been like, okay, great, but that's not who I was anymore. And my mom's sitting next to me like, okay, great, and I'm like, no. And I started crying, and we left there. And I'm like, that man is not touching me, because I'd already read immediately. I like bought books and read this stuff, and I knew there was a very strong chance that I could lose my voice if the cancer was near my vocal cords. And again, I'd been a singer, I was a teacher, I was an actress, I like to talk, I like to use my voice. um I'm like, that this man is not going to try to save my vocal cords. This man is going to try to get like to a 3 p.m. tea time, you know. um and my mom's like, well, what do like, it is what it is, and we've made the surgery. And I was like, I can't believe this is my life. Like, I can't believe this is happening. And then I ended up in a conversation with someone that I knew. I told him, I have thyroid cancer. I'm supposed to have a surgery. He goes, oh, are you with Dr. Blubbity Blah? And I said, no, I'm with this other guy who's like 1,000 years old. He's like, no, 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 no. You got to see my friend. He's the best in Canada. I went at 7 a.m. on my 40th birthday and met my doctor, Dr. Ricky Payne. I will shout him out because Dr. Ricky Payne, Montreal. And as soon as he walked into the room, I knew he was my man. And, he was everything you want in a surgeon. He got me in, I think, 2 weeks after that. When I came out, he was like, he was like joking with me. He was like, you really gave us a scare there. Like, I thought I was just going to be like in and out. But when I opened you up, turned out so this is when I found out that the tumor had grown legs, and it was wrapping around my vocal cords. It was on my carotid artery. I had my total thyroidectomy in November of 2015, and then I had a partial right neck dissection of like 2 or 3 chains of lymph nodes in January of 2016. So like 2 months later. Then I had the radio. No, it wasn't January, it was March. And then I had the radioactive iodine in May of 2016. And then I had a lymphectomy because the lymph nodes keep growing back around where the tumor was. So all around where my scar is, just on the right side. Since then, it's just been a lot of PET scans and biopsies and ultrasounds. Why does it have to be an automatic death sentence to be validated? Cancer is cancer. It is a traumatizing thing to be told that you have cancer. Whether it's curable, not curable, painfully curable, like, it's all shitty. It's shitty to do that and especially to a woman, to take our voice away. So I was angry, and then I was even more angry, and then I was told I wasn't allowed to be angry, I wasn't allowed to be sad, I wasn't allowed to lean on anybody. I was angry at everyone around me because everyone was treating it like it was like I had the chicken pox or something, you know? And it was such a weird thing to navigate. The doctor looked at me, he's like, your life now as you're living it is what I advocate to people who are newly diagnosed with cancer. But for you, it seems to be like the stress of being so healthy has made you so sick that I wish I could prescribe you like a vacation and a glass of wine and a pizza. That's literally what this doctor said to me, because being healthy, again, air quotes, being healthy was stressing me out so much that it was compounding everything, which is why also I advocate like, wellness is such a murky thing. I'm a huge fan of wellness. I'm a huge fan of doing whatever makes you feel good in that world, but it's like I was the test rabbit for everything. I have a chronic illness now. I have chronic tall cell cancer. So when people say to me, "Oh, but you're fine because like you take it out, you take your Synthroid and you're fine." So I have this cancer now that lives in my neck. And the way that my first surgeon described it is like, imagine that somebody like breaks, takes this glass and like smashes it in and breaks it. There's going to be the big pieces that you can pick out. And then there's going to be like the tiny little chips and flecks. And those tiny chips and flecks over time will grow in my lymph nodes. So I still have ultrasounds. Most people after 5 years, they're good. They're good. I still have ultrasounds at least twice a year, sometimes more. I usually end up having a biopsy. I have blood tests. And I live with this thing that, like, anytime it could come back. Like, it's in there. There's been a lymph node in there. And so there's a lymph node, like, right there that it's been there for 3 years. They're just watching it because that's what they do now. Anyone that survives cancer, whether it's thyroid cancer or a more intense cancer, like you're still surviving cancer and you're going to see the world differently. When I met my husband, it was 5 years after. Like, he's been through the last 5 years with me, but he wasn't there in the beginning. And he doesn't understand why sometimes I view time differently. I view, situations differently. I'm on a much like I was pushing us to move in. I was pushing us to get married. And he's like, whoa, 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 whoa. And I'm like, no, because you don't know. You never know. Like, dance like no one's watching. Live every day like it's your last, and I've kind of chilled out on that. But like every year when I have to go, like I'm also going back to be checked on this in August. And like every time I get close to one of those appointments, I start like wanting to plan a trip to the other side of the world and like rewriting my will and being like extra super, like it's just this weird thing where it changes your perspective a little bit on life. And it's so important what you're doing and sharing people's stories so that we can all have someone to relate to. Check your neck, as they say. If you are experiencing anything in your body that feels like your body is doing its own thing, like you eat well and you exercise and you just feel like not correct, like the what's happening doesn't reflect how you're behaving, what's happening doesn't reflect what you're putting into your body, anything that feels off, especially if you're a woman, especially if you are near perimenopause, if you are having crazy periods, like I urge you to make sure you have a thyroid panel, a full thyroid panel, not just your TSH. I'm talking like free T3, T4, reverse T3, T4, the thyroglobulin, like all the things. And just if your doctor won't do it, find another doctor because no one knows you better than you. And no one can tell you that everything's okay if you know something is not okay. And I know it's not always easy. I know that we all have challenges where we are in the world with our medical system and our healthcare system. But I'm telling you, if you don't advocate for yourself, no one else is going to.